Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee. A very warm welcome to members and officers and to members of the public. I apologise for the technical difficulties we experienced when we started at 6 o'clock, so we're restarting this meeting at 10 minutes past 6. And I will hand over to Mr. Hanton from Democratic Services for the housekeeping arrangements.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening. Please note that this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee is being recorded by the Council and will be published on the Council website for a minimum of 6 months. Please could everybody present please follow these ground rules. Only speak when invited to by the Chairman. Please use your desk microphones when speaking, and please mute or turn off your microphone when you have finished speaking. If accessing the meeting via Teams, always turn on your video function when invited to speak and state your name. If accessing via Teams and you would like to speak, please use the raise your hand feature in the Teams window. For those in the room, please note that if the fire alarm sounds, you should exit the building by the nearest available signed fire exit route and make your way to the ground floor of the multi-storey car park. Finally, Chairman, please ensure that background noise is kept to a minimum and that mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanton. Could I ask you now to deal with items 1 through to 4 on our agenda, please?
Chairman, we've received apologies from Councillor Phipps and from Councillor Brown. Then moving on to item 2, substitute members have been formally appointed. Councillor Dedman is substituting for Councillor Phipps and Councillor Matthews for Councillor Brown. Item 3, Chairman, is to invite any members to make any declarations of interest.
If I could start by declaring that I have been fulfilling an observer status at BH Live board meetings for some months now, and that I think is something that the public should be aware of. Thank you, Mr. Hanton. And the Vice Chairman would also like to make a declaration.
Yes, I'd like to declare I'm a member of the Arts Council, which is a funder of BH Live.
Councillor Brooke.
It may not seem relevant, but in view of the issues that are raised in the report in agenda item 6, I declare that I'm a board member of Bournemouth Development Company. There is the issue of whether councillors should or should not be on such company boards.
I think that is all the declarations, Mr. Hanton.
Thank you, Chairman. Item 4, Chairman, is the confirmation of the minutes of the previous meeting.
Members, are you content that those are a full and accurate record of the meeting that we held on the 29th of July and that I can sign them on your behalf? Councillor Brooke?
I'm quite happy to agree the minutes, Chair, but I do have an issue relating to the first paragraph on page 10.
Would you like to explain, please?
It mentions that there was various questions asked in connection with the LGA Peer Challenge in November 2021, and responses were promised this committee. I'm not aware of us having received any responses to those questions.
Thank you, Councillor Brooke. I wonder whether the intention was that it would be at the next regular committee meeting rather than this, which is a special additional meeting. I don't know, Mr. Hanton, whether you can help me on that.
Sorry, Chairman, to help you on that, but I can certainly make sure that's covered at the next meeting.
So if we were to change that to the next regular meeting, Councillor Brooke, which is on the 28th of October, if we change that in the minute specific, would that satisfy your comment?
That would be fine, Chair, yes.
Thank you very much indeed. We will do that, and when I come to signing the minutes, I will make that amendment. Thank you very much. Could I welcome the two substitute members at this evening's meeting, Councillor Deadman and Councillor Matthews. You're very welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee, which I hope you find interesting and informative. Item 5 on the agenda is public issues. Do we have any public issues, Mr. Hanton?
There are no public issues, Chairman.
In that case, we will get to the substantive item on this evening's agenda, which is a review of the BH Live contractual and governance arrangements. I propose that we deal with these in the following way. You have the papers before you, and they are a report authored by Chris Saunders, BCP Council Service Director for Destination and Culture. And I will ask Mr. Saunders to introduce and explain the report in as much detail as he thinks is appropriate. Immediately following which, I will call on Chris Simons, who's the Chief Executive of BH Live, to deal with other issues that pertain particularly to the operation of BH Live. And it's after that that I will go to members for questions. I'd very much like everybody to have the full picture from both speakers before we go to questions, rather than intervening at certain stages. So if you could make notes of anything you want to raise, we'll deal with them as appropriate after both have spoken, and then perhaps one or both of them can respond to any questions that are felt necessary. So without any further ado, can I ask Mr. Saunders to introduce and add to the report as he thinks appropriate. Mr. Saunders.
And thanks for the opportunity to bring the report to Audit and Governance panel. We were asked to bring forward the report as a review of BH Live's contractual and governance arrangements, and hopefully it will give members an update of where we've been over the last, or the journey we've been on over the last few months, and where we are now. We're very keen to keep in contractual relationship and those governance relationships. So I'm very keen to hear what you've got to say. It's worth just pointing out that BH Live has a 25-year legal agreement with the council for the provision of leisure, arts and cultural services. So they currently operate the BIC, the Pavilion, to Bournemouth Pavilion, and 3 leisure centres in the Bournemouth area on behalf of the council. BH Live have also got some other leisure interests in the area, David English and Queen's Park and Corfe Mullen Centre, which are not part of that agreement and not part of the council's interests in that. And that agreement really relates to the independence of the trust. So there's a separate part of the agreement which talks about BH Live being independent of the council, and the fact it was established about 10 years ago now on the as a company limited by guarantee, exclusively for charitable purposes, and the council acknowledges the independence of that trust, which I think is quite a key point in the discussions this evening. Over the last few years, there's been some additional considerations taking place. So BH Live has grown and has some regional contracts. Within the council, of course, there's been significant changes within the officer structure, but also within the political makeup, and of course, as a new council as well. It was Bournemouth Borough Council that originally had the contract with BH Live. There's been some changes to the senior leadership within BH Live themselves, and Chris, who you hear from, he came in as CEO about 18 months or so ago now, maybe 2 years. Probably feels like a very long 18 months. And of course, the COVID pandemic has impacted BH Live, and it'd be fair to say that sort of at the start of the pandemic, they literally had the tap turned off for all of the income, the same as every other leisure trust and every other leisure or cultural provider had across the country. So we're to have a look at the governance structure. You'll note in the paper that back in back earlier on last year, as part of the sort of the COVID response to trying to support BH Live, there were a number of things put in place. So if you look at sort of the background in 1.1, there were 4 areas there. So clarity over roles of councillors, which was done, and there was some additional training given to members and the board members. There was some an annual report requested overview and scrutiny panel, which was delivered in April 21. The fact that the BH Live financial reporting for the Bournemouth contracts was on open book, and the fact that governance and contract management arrangements were improved and embedded. And if you see in 2.7, it'll give you an idea of the sort of the cycle that we go through now, that we've put in place to go through to strengthen that relationship. And where we are now within that, I think, is very much improved. I'd just also like to point out that the key point for this meeting is that the board memberships, obviously on the BH Live main board, we've got Councillor Bartlett and Councillor Iyengar, and as the chair said, currently as a board observer. And on the BH Live Enterprises board, which is the subsidiary board, we've currently got Councillor Bartlett and Councillor Edwards. So that's on there. So going with the sort of the recommendations of the report, the committee may wish to consider any sort of potential conflict of interest as it sees fit, as whether councillors should continue on the board, or even indeed whether the observer role should continue going forward. I've just like to finish really and say that BH Live are a key contractor with us. We've got on the leisure side, we've also got SLM, who everyone active, who run the pool sites, and also we run Two Rivers Meet ourselves. So there's a sort of mixed bag of leisure providers within the area, and something that we're going to have a look at over the next year, in the run up to when the SLM contract finishes in June 2023. Chair, that probably sums it up, unless there's anything else you particularly would like to pick up on.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Saunders. There are various issues, as I'm sure other members will have, but I'll reserve those for when we get to questions. So as planned, could I ask Mr. Simons, Chief Executive of BH Live, if you'd like to give us an update and an overview of the work of BH Live and the role as he sees it, so that we can consider the governance issues appertaining directly to BH Live this evening. Mr. Simons.
Thank you, Chair. So I've been asked tonight to give you an update on our relationship effectively, and some of the changes that have taken place over the last 12 to 18 months. As Mr. Saunders alluded to, I started in April 2019, and it's close to a 10-year anniversary of the original formation of BH Live out of Bournemouth Council. It's not an unusual model in the leisure and arts sector. Certainly in the leisure sector, there's about 100 odd similar charities that service local authorities. The majority of those have been born from the local authority, as we were in Bournemouth. My previous role, I was working for another charity that had done something very similar 30 years ago in Greenwich. And that's relevant because it brings to the table some experience in governance arrangements in BCP or Bournemouth Council previously. As Mr. Saunders pointed out on table 2.7, there's a range of contractual and partnership meetings, contract requirements, performance reviews now embedded within the relationship. And I think it's fair to say that on arrival, some of those had moved away from the regularity that you would perhaps expect. There was a lot of changes going on at a singular point in time, and it's good that we're back on a standardised approach to a contractual and a partnership relationship. Previously, I'd have circa 40 plus clients similar to BCP, and this is much closer to the expectation and good practice that is found elsewhere around the country. I think just to add to some of the points that I alluded to in the report, COVID has obviously been a shocking period for those in the hospitality, leisure and cultural sector. The hospitality sector, as you'll know, no doubt from authorities, services, but also from your own personal use in the area, has been a stuttered start for many months. Leisure was similarly open, then closed, then reopened again, and then opened with restrictions. And we are only really just seeing the reopening of the arts and the cultural sector, with some conferences coming through as well. So what was predicted previously as a close to a £50 million turnover in 2020, it effectively went down to less than 3. So overnight, the taps, as Mr. Saunders mentioned, were turned off. BH Live sought a range of arrangements with our partners, BCP Council being our primary partner. You know, the majority of our business is with the authority, and we are of the authority. So we very much see and value this relationship. We've managed to battle through the COVID year, and we're now re-emerging in 2021-22 in a much better position. That includes contract arrangements in other areas that are going positively. And the intention of those is to isolate as far as we can legally the operations of those other contracts to those local areas. We should have concluded all of those by the end of this calendar year, in lieu of setting our budget profiles for the next 2 to 3 years thereafter. During this period also, there's been a range of discussions with the authorities about types of reporting and data, and I'm pleased to also say thanks to the Arts Council for some of the CRF funding that was available. We managed to update a number of our internalised systems that give us much more insight and ability to forward project. The digitalisation of the business is still on its way, but it benefits us as both a partner to the authority and an independent organisation in terms of being able to analyse income flows and project in much more detail, and that is automated based upon data flows coming in. So that's been a huge movement over the last 6 months to 12 months. Our board, and it touches on the report, I don't think it particularly outlines the full scope of our board, but our board has largely been in place for close to 10 years now, and so we recognise that there's a natural succession that needs to occur. There is a skill set audit about to take place to get an understanding of where our strengths as a board and the individuals on that board lay, as well as a diversity programme that we need to consider based upon the change in the world and the local areas that we work in over the last decade or so. And finally, I think it's worth touching on the work that we are partaking with the authority on, looking at strategic investments in the BCP venues to look forward over the next 5 to 10 years and not look just forward over the next year or so. In terms of our operations, I'm pleased to report that all the BCP venues are now fully opened. The restrictions are largely lifted. The leisure centres are fully opened. The pavilion has got a large programme coming forward in the last 6 months of the year, approximately 170 events are booked there, and approximately 76 large-scale events at the BIC, which, to put it into context, is nearly as much as the last full-year number of events at the BIC. So there's been a huge concertina effect of those events, and I'm sure Councillor Williams will attest to that against other arts venues up and down the country. Conferencing is a little bit slower. The cycle conferencing tends to be annually, every 2 years or every 3 years. So some of those conferences coming in are slightly slower, but I'm pleased to say that it's been a very positive first 3 months, and we're looking forward to finishing the year in a much stronger financial position. I think, Chair, if that's okay, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Simons. I think it might be helpful, before we go to questions, if I just filled in 1 or 2 gaps, particularly around the history and evolution of BH Live, and also the observer role and what I have been doing quite separately from my role on Audit and Governance Committee during that intervening period. I think the clarity there may be of some assistance. So we've heard that BH Live was set up in 2010 by the former Bournemouth Council, and I was integral in setting that up in terms of the council's activities at that time. And why that's important is because we set out the governance and all the other arrangements at that time when we set up BH Live. And I obviously was the main link between the company and the council at the member level, together with the senior and appropriate officers through to 2019, when BCP Council was formed. And so the history of it, very much I understand, and the evolution, which I think Mr. Simons has touched on, as has Mr. Saunders this evening. Those are important because that is the contract that was inherited by BCP Council. A significant amount of legal and other external advice was taken at the time that BH Live was set up, so it wasn't done in-house by any means, and indeed all of those recommendations were taken on board as part of the governance of BH Live at that stage. Rolling forward to the observer role, I think at the time of about July of last year, particularly as COVID really began to bite into the business model of BH Live, it was necessary for the council to understand far more closely what those financial and practical considerations were. And I was asked by the leader and deputy leader to fulfil this observer role, which I have been doing. And it is simply that. It is the role of being an observer. And then, if you like, acting as an intermediary, perhaps, between the senior management of BH Live and the senior management and members of BCP Council. And that has proven, I think, to be quite helpful in trying to make sure that we address the right issues in the right order to get us to the position we are today. And we're in a very, very much better position than we were at that time earlier on during the pandemic, which, as Mr. Simons has said, put the business model of BH Live in considerable jeopardy, I think it's fair to say, as it did to leisure providers and those in hospitality up and down the country. And so that role has largely been fulfilled, and I will, if you want me to, explain what I think the way forward is as far as that observer status is concerned later on in the meeting. But we have got to the position that's been set out. I want to make sure that we concentrate completely and exclusively on arrangements this evening. That is our remit, and members from about a year ago, and it's set out in the background at 1 in the paper, that issue came to us as a special item of Audit and Governance Committee, having already gone to the Overview and Scrutiny Board, and we had a significant piece of work in the paper, but we wanted to bring it back at a later stage, and that is tonight, in order to review those governance arrangements and to get a better understanding of whether they're fit for purpose going forward, and making sure that we have then done our piece of the work to the satisfaction of members and of the council. So I'm in your hands now, members of the committee, for questions. Councillor Filer.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I've read the report with interest, and I'm quite mystified as to why the report suggests that councillors should not be taking a part in the board. It's a council. BH Live is a council operation, and I particularly take well, I don't quite understand 5.12, all the fives really, as to why councillors might not want to be that we might not think it was a good idea to have councillors actually on the board and the observer as well. Yes, I accept the point in 5.1 that it's not a statutory duty, but all of the outside bodies that we attend are not statutory. I think most of them we're invited to take part in, whether it be a school governorship, all the different boards that we go on. They're not statutory, but because we're interested in what goes on in our community, and particularly in this case, because this is a facility of the council, and we're very much involved. I've never been on the board, but I was very much involved when it was first set up. It's 5.2 suggests that before we accept an appointment to an outside body, we should check the legal status of the organisation. I'd like to think that most councillors, when they're appointed to something, the fire authority or anything else, don't do that. But it probably is something perhaps we should, but I think we don't. And I don't think we do on this one. And the suggestion that it might have a conflict, because in 5.4, the suggestion seems to be that if BH Live were not doing too well, it could have an effect on our, was it 5.4, on our residents? Well, the same would apply to being a school governor. Actually, if a school was failing, that school would be in a community of which the residents would be our residents, and it would have an effect on them. I feel that absolutely essential that the council has members of the board, and that they should be there. I can't see any reason why we wouldn't. It's our organisation. It's up to us to appoint people to serve on that board, and I'd like to suggest that we don't agree with that. I think this is absolutely wrong, and we can't just let one of our organisations go off and have absolutely no oversight by us who've been elected to absolutely oversee these things.
Thank you, Councillor Filer. Well, the author of the report was Mr. Saunders, and I purposely had no input into the report. I felt it was really important that we are seen to be acting independently as an Audit and Governance Committee, and so the report received by us this evening is that completely authored by officers. So I wonder, Mr. Saunders, if you'd like to comment on the points that Councillor Mrs. Filer has raised, just so that we don't retread the ground too often.
Yeah, happy to. I think I might, in terms of some of the conflict of interest, I probably need to bring in Susan's Rice into that for some legal advice. But just sort of go back to the point about BH Live being a council operation. BH Live is a standalone, separate company to the council. Is not a council operation, and we have, as part of our agreement with BH Live, some places on the board for councillors or for whoever we deem fit to be on there. That's our request originally at the beginning of the way it was set up originally, but it is not a council operation. I think that's quite an important distinction. In terms of what councillors should and shouldn't do when pointing to an external organisation, I think I probably would need to bring in Susan's Rice into that.
Thank you, Mr. Saunders. Ms. Seiss, I wonder whether you'd like to comment broadly on the issue raised around conflicts and the legal issues for councillors sitting on such a body as BH Live's board.
Yes, Chairman, certainly. So the general difficulty arises as a result of obligations under the Companies Act. So if you are on a board of a company, which this is, although it's a charity, you have a legal responsibility to put the interests of the company first. And this may from time to time come into conflict with your obligation to put the residents of your council area first. So I wouldn't imagine that there would be a blanket conflict, but conflicts may arise from time to time. For example, should the financial interests of the company and the council not align. So that would be my general comment at this point, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Seiss. Councillor Dedman.
Oh yes, thank you, Chairman. I was only going to comment on what Councillor Filer said, which I broadly agree with, and also what the monitoring officer has said. I mean, the only conflict I can see in terms of the governance is the mere fact that you are chairing this committee which we're talking on, and you've already declared an interest, and maybe overview and scrutiny. But apart from that, and when the interest is declared, then that's perfectly a valid situation. So I'm really with Councillor Filer that I may be misreading the monitoring officer, but I'm still wondering about the conflict, if there is one at all.
Thank you. Vice Chairman.
Excuse me. Thank you, Chair. Some years ago, Bournemouth Borough Council, I had excuse me, a portfolio which was corporate one. After I think about a year and a half, I was then given the portfolio for tourism, leisure and the arts. At that point, I was advised by the then monitoring officer that I should probably resign from the board of BH Live, as it was felt there was too much of a conflict, and I did. I did go back onto the board several years later when I was no longer the portfolio holder, and that again was deemed okay. So that's my personal experience.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. I may well be a lone voice here. I'm not sure that councillors should be on the boards. I think there are issues, as Susan Zeiss has referred to. I mean, for instance, if there was something that came to a vote, you would probably not be able to vote because of your interest and the conflict. Consequently, what value are you actually providing either to the council in your role as a councillor or in your role as a board director if you are not able to support the board where there's a vote or support the council because of that conflict of interest. There are monitoring procedures. I'm not 100% clear on how the structure actually works that we've been presented with, but there are relationships between the board of directors and the company and the council which are supposedly monitored in a variety of different ways. So again, what do the board members as councillors offer to the council or to the board? I'm not, as a board member myself of one of the similar companies, I've fortunately never been in a position where I've had to not be able to vote because mainly there haven't been financial decisions. But I would not, for instance, have been able to have been on the planning committee when there was a recent meeting because of the planning application that came forward. I would not be able to support the development company with proposals if there were votes at council as to whether to accept those proposals or provide additional money or anything else. So I don't see an overall purpose for councillors to be on the board, especially when there is a supposed relationship between the council and the company in terms of monitoring and governance. With all due respect, Chair, I don't see the need for an observer either.
As I said earlier, I will comment on that particular role at the appropriate time this evening, but I want to hear from members generally first. I don't know, Ms Dice, whether you'd like to comment again at this stage in the light of what has been said by Councillor Devon and by Councillor Brooke. Have you anything fresh to add to what you've already said, do you think?
Chairman, only just that I can give some examples of where these conflicts would arise, and I know the Chief Executive can as well. It does affect portfolio holders and those in decision-making roles over the finances more possibly than others, or those who sit on our regulatory committee. So each circumstance would have to be looked at as it comes up. And as I said before, I can't really say that there would be a blanket conflict, but when the conflicts arise, they certainly are real. The other one last thing I would say is that we have a contractual relationship with this company. So performance can be monitored through that contractor relationship, and it may not be absolutely necessary to have members on the board. That is obviously a decision for you, but that contractor relationship should stand in any event. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Dyson. From the comment you made just then, I take it the Chief Executive would like to comment as well. Mr Farrant.
Thank you, Chairman. I think it's worth saying that many councils that set up trusts do have councillors on the boards of the trust, and they maintain a position on the board. So this is not a blanket ban, but the relationship between the two organisations is quite a tricky one, in the sense of the council sets up the trust and wants the trust to deliver its objectives, and therefore wants to maintain an overview of that through the opportunity through the board to do that. And yet the company's main source of income is derived through a contract with the council, and therefore it needs to negotiate that from the company's point of view. And therefore I think there will be many times where council on the board could see there is a conflict and have to declare that conflict at the board and either absent themselves from the discussion, which would be the normal case, or not participate. So I think it is a complex environment, and in this particular contract, with the way it's been run historically, that the surplus generated through BH Live is effectively returned to the council to support the revenue budgets long term, although that hasn't been the case during the COVID period, but it certainly was the case previously to a reasonably. I think that gives the councillor themselves, a potential conflict, because ideally, of course, you would want to drive the maximum revenue coming back to the council and the maximum benefit to the council from it. But that may not be in the company's interest if, for example, it has investment opportunities. And then, of course, you have the potential issue of what if the company then wants to go and bid for contract outside the council's area, as BH Life has done. What's the view of the BCP councillor in that? So I think it's a complicated environment. I don't think this report is saying you shouldn't have, but I think we absolutely should be clear that there is significant potential for conflict within that relationship. And it's a matter of judgment, I think, about how strong those relationships are and who should be on the board, if anybody. And I think that's the point the board is, the paper is trying to draw out.
Thank you very much, Mr Farrant. Councillor Fear.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a really interesting discussion so far. I'd like to thank everyone for their comments. I still think what the monitoring officer said makes it quite clear. The board isn't a majority of councillors, as we've heard from the monitoring officer. On each item in particular, it can be looked if there is a conflict of interest. Having councillors on a board of, as it does say in the report, a major local employer with over 1,300 staff, who, for me, it's just straightforward really, and as a governance issue, it's a positive thing to have the people's representatives in a small part on the board, feeding in through one avenue. I know there's many forms on that through this process, but as it was an original setup by the chairman of Audit and Governance, it'd be interesting to hear his thoughts on this later on in the debate. I think I might be concurring with him on what he